Ruthless biker punches. Elderly black woman, KO, unaware. Hearse, the bar was buzzing with loud music, clinking glasses, and the occasional burst of laughter from a rowdy group in the corner. Outside, the night air was thick with the scent of gasoline and burnt rubber as a gang of bikers rumbled into the parking lot. Their leader, a towering man with a shaved head and a jagged scar running across his jaw, stepped off his bike with an air of arrogance. People inside barely noticed as the gang made their way in, but one person was about to become their unfortunate target. At a small table near the entrance, an elderly woman sat alone, stirring her tea with steady hands. Her name was Mrs. Johnson, a well-respected retired school teacher who had spent decades shaping young minds in her community. She had simply stopped in for a quick drink before heading home, unaware that fate had placed her in the wrong place at the wrong time. The biker leader, known on the streets as Crusher, had a reputation for being merciless. He thrived on intimidation, feeding off the fear of others. When he spotted Mrs. Johnson, he sneered. She was an easy target, vulnerable, an outsider in a place like this. The rest of the bar was too afraid to intervene as he swaggered toward her table, his boots echoing against the wooden floor. "Hey, old lady," he slurred, his breath reeking of whiskey. "You lost or something." Mrs. Johnson looked up, unfazed. "I'm just minding my business, young man." But Crusher wasn't the type to let things go. The gang behind him chuckled, egging him on. His ego demanded a reaction. Without warning, he reached out and knocked her cup off the table, sending the hot tea splattering across the floor. The bar fell silent. Mrs. Johnson let out a slow breath, still composed. She had seen far worse in her life. "That was unnecessary," she said calmly. Crusher grinned, leaning in closer. "And what are you going to do about it, Grandma?" The next few seconds felt like a slow-motion nightmare. Without hesitation, Crusher pulled back his massive fist and, with all the force of a wrecking ball, swung at her. Gasps erupted as the blow connected, sending Mrs. Johnson crashing to the ground, unconscious. The room froze. The air was thick with disbelief. Even some of Crusher's own men looked shocked. An elderly woman, defenseless, struck down in a single hit. But what Crusher didn't know, what no one in that bar knew, was that Mrs. Johnson wasn't just anyone. She had a son, and that son was a force of nature. Just as the shock was settling in, the door swung open again. A man stepped in, his presence shifting the entire energy of the room. He was tall, built like a statue, carved from stone, his piercing eyes scanning the scene in an instant. He was calm, controlled, but there was something in the way he moved, something dangerous. This was David Johnson, an off-duty Navy SEAL, and he had just walked into a nightmare. His eyes locked onto his mother, motionless on the ground. For a split second, everything else faded. The music, the murmurs, the stunned expressions. It all disappeared. All that remained was the roaring fire building inside him. Crusher, oblivious to who he had just wronged, turned with a smirk. "What, you here to pick up your grandma?" he scoffed. David didn't speak. He didn't blink. His hands clenched into fists, so tightly his knuckles turned white. The room was still, as if even the walls were holding their breath. Then, in one swift motion, he stepped forward. What happened next would have the entire courtroom gasping in disbelief. The moment David stepped forward, the air in the bar seemed to shift. People instinctively moved back, sensing something was about to happen. Crusher, still grinning, had no idea who he was dealing with. He saw a man, slightly younger, maybe a bit stronger than the usual guys he bullied, but nothing that worried him. David, on the other hand, was trained to read people in seconds. He noticed the way Crusher held himself, the slight delay in his movements from too much drinking, the overconfidence in his stance. He wasn't just a brute. He was a bully who had never been challenged by someone who could truly fight back. David knelt beside his mother, gently placing 2 fingers on her wrist. Her pulse was there, steady, but she was unconscious. His jaw tightened, his breath controlled. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about justice. A nervous murmur rippled through the bar. Some of the customers whispered to each other, recognizing David now. Word traveled fast in small towns, and everyone knew Mrs. Johnson's son had served in the Navy. What many didn't know was that he was no ordinary soldier. On his off-duty Navy SEAL, Crusher let out a short laugh, breaking the silence. "What's wrong? Got nothing to say?" He took a step closer, towering over David. "You gonna cry over your mommy?" David slowly stood up, his movements controlled, precise. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and steady. "You should leave now." The confidence in those 4 words made Crusher hesitate for half a second, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "Or what?" he taunted. "You gonna teach me a lesson?" David didn't answer. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes was enough. Crusher's gang was watching closely, some of them shifting uncomfortably now. They'd seen their leader dominate plenty of fights, but this was different. There was no fear in David's stance, no nervous energy, just cold, trained precision. One of the bikers, a wiry man with a snake tattoo curling around his neck, leaned in toward Crusher. "Man, I think we should go," he muttered under his breath. Crusher scoffed. "Are you kidding? Look at this guy. He's just standing there." He turned back to David, puffing out his chest. "If you got something to say it." David's expression didn't change. "Last chance. Walk away." The room was so silent now that the hum of the flickering neon sign outside was the only sound. Crusher clenched his fists, his pride demanding a reaction. He had made a spectacle of himself, and there was no way he was backing down in front of his crew. Then, in a flash, he lunged. David barely moved. In a smooth, almost effortless motion, he sidestepped, causing Crusher's wild punch to swing through empty air. Before Crusher could react, David locked his arm, twisting it with just enough pressure to send a warning. The bigger man grunted in pain, trying to pull away, but David's grip was like steel. "Let go!" Crusher spat through clenched teeth, his face reddening. David didn't respond. He simply tightened his hold, just enough to make his point. The sound of bones shifting made the bikers wince. Crusher tried to twist free again, but this time, David shifted his weight, sending him stumbling forward. He released him in a controlled movement, allowing Crusher to regain his balance without falling. The message was clear. "I can break you if I want to." Crusher spun around, breathing heavily, his face flushed with rage and humiliation. No one had ever made him look weak before. His men were watching, waiting for his next move. He couldn't back down now, not without losing all control over them. His hand shot toward his belt, where a pocket knife gleamed under the dim lights. That was a mistake. Before the blade could even clear his pocket, David moved. In a flash, he had Crusher's wrist locked in an iron grip, twisting just enough to make the knife drop to the floor with a sharp clatter. In the same movement, he pressed his other hand against Crusher's chest, forcing him backward against the bar. The force wasn't brutal, but it was absolute. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Crusher's gang shifted uneasily. This wasn't just a fight anymore. This was a man who had complete control over the situation, over his opponent, over everything. Crusher's breaths were ragged now, his chest rising and falling rapidly. His body knew something his mind refused to admit. He had lost. David leaned in just slightly, his voice quiet but firm. "You don't hit women. You don't touch my mother. And if you ever come near her again, I won't be this patient." The finality in his tone sent a chill down Crusher's spine. He could feel the power behind those words. This wasn't a threat, it was a promise. Slowly David released him. Crusher stood there for a moment, chest heaving, fists trembling. But he didn't make another move. His gang was watching, waiting for him to do something. But he had nothing left. No comeback, no fight. The bar remained eerily silent as David turned back to his mother. Gently, he lifted her into his arms, cradling her like the most precious thing in the world. As he made his way to the door, the crowd parted for him, whispering in hushed tones. Crusher's gang shifted uncomfortably, avoiding his gaze. No one wanted to acknowledge what had just happened. No one wanted to say it out loud. But they all knew. The reign of Crusher had just ended, and he never even saw it coming. What happened next would leave an entire courtroom gasping in disbelief. The ride to the hospital was quiet, except for the steady hum of the engine and the rhythmic breathing of Mrs. Johnson in the back seat. David kept his focus on the road, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. But his mind was racing. His mother had always been strong, stronger than most. She had raised him on her own, teaching him discipline, respect, and the importance of standing up for what was right. And now, because of some lowlife with an ego too big for his own good, she lay unconscious in a hospital bed, bruised but stable. The doctors assured him she would recover, but David couldn't shake the image of her lying helpless on that bar floor. It wasn't just about what had happened. It was about what could have happened if he hadn't arrived when he did. That thought alone made his blood run cold. Word of the incident spread quickly, and by the next morning, the police were involved. Surveillance footage from the bar had captured everything. The unprovoked attack, the way Crusher had struck without hesitation, and the controlled but firm way David had handled him. It was more than enough evidence to press charges. When the officers showed up at Crusher's hangout, he was still nursing his pride and his wrist. The pain from David's grip hadn't faded, and the shame of being humiliated in front of his gang still burned deep. But when the cops slapped the cuffs on him and read him his rights, reality hit him like a freight train. He wasn't the untouchable king of the bar anymore. The trial moved quickly. The footage left no room for debate, and the witnesses, many of whom had been too afraid to speak out before, were now more than willing to testify. Mrs. Johnson, despite her injuries, took the stand with quiet dignity. She didn't speak with anger or vengeance, only truth. David too was called up. The courtroom was packed, everyone eager to see how the story would unfold. As he recounted the events, there was no bravado in his voice, no need to exaggerate. He spoke plainly, letting the facts speak for themselves. Then came the moment that left the entire courtroom gasping. Crusher, who had been mostly silent throughout the trial, suddenly spoke up when the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing. His voice was rough, but there was something in his tone that no one expected. Regret. "I don't know what came over me that night," he muttered, avoiding David's eyes. "I ain't making excuses. I was drunk, yeah, but that don't justify what I did. I see that now." He swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. I lost myself somewhere along the way." The room was stunned. No one had expected the ruthless biker to show even a sliver of remorse. The judge nodded, considering his words carefully, before delivering the final verdict. Crusher was sentenced to time behind bars, along with mandatory anger management and rehabilitation. The decision wasn't just about punishment. It was about forcing him to face his own demons. As the courtroom emptied, David walked over to his mother, offering his arm for support. She smiled up at him, the warmth in her eyes unchanged despite everything she had been through. "You handled that well," she said softly. David exhaled, finally letting go of the tension he had been holding. "I learned from the best." Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Life would move on, as it always did. But one thing was certain. No matter how dark the world could get, there would always be people willing to stand up for what was right. And sometimes, justice didn't just come from fists or the law. It came from knowing when to walk away, when to forgive, and when to let life take its course.